Good evening and welcome to our biweekly Cows and Chaos webinar series. My name is Dean Dick. I'm the Farm Management Specialist at the Ag Info Center, and I'll be helping run this webinar today. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping items for those of you who have first times on this GoToWebinar. This session is being recorded, and you'll get a link to the recording tomorrow in an email. Secondly, if you want to ask a question of our presenter, there is a question box on the GoToWebinar panel on your screen. So type that in, and we will take questions at the end of the webinar. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Barry Remcio, our beef and forage specialist at the Ag Info Center, and he's going to talk about what do the feed test results mean. So Barry, go ahead.
Thanks, Dean. Appreciate it. If the audience wishes to type in a question and have it answered as we're going through the presentation, Dean, please interrupt me and read the question out so we can answer the question as we're going along. This seminar or webinar is a follow-up from the webinar from 2 weeks ago where we talked about how do we take samples, what do we need to request, how do we get things put together so that we can get some meaningful results and go ahead and start working towards the ration. So the next step in the whole process is you've got your feed test results ahead of you or in front of you. What do you do with them? So the topics that we're going to cover tonight are we sure we've got the right samples or identification of the samples, discussing dry versus as-fed results, protein, fibers, energy, macro and micro minerals, energy, vitamins, nitrates, a couple other topics on calculations and conclusions to where do we go after this. So the definitions that are in the presentation tonight, a lot of them came from the Alberta Agriculture AgDex Know Your Feed terms. Some came from the Beef Cattle Research Council, and there's some that I managed to get off of other extension websites out of the States, and those will be notarized by hot links as to where I got the information from. So the first thing we have to look at is the accuracy of the analysis. How did you take that sample? If you used a grab sample versus a core sampling tool, there's a significant difference in the amount of protein energy in the results. And if you've looked at the area around a bunch of bales in the wintertime when there's snow, if you decide to go ahead and grab a handful of hay out of that bale just to take a look at it, you'll notice that there's a lot of green leaf material, a lot of fine material on the ground or on top of the snow, and that's where you get the majority of the protein and the energy from. So using a core sampling tool will definitely give you a more accurate result and something that was more reflective in what your feed quality is. For a lactating cow ration, for example, they need 11% protein and 60% TDN. So the difference between the core and the grab sample would be about 5 or 6 pounds of barley and half a pound of canola meal. So that would be roughly 60 cents per head per day. The feed test report, I just grabbed one that came in to me here a couple weeks ago. And that's what the original portion looks like. You've got who sent in the sample, the grower's name, the report number, and the lab number. And the important thing is when you sent in the sample, hopefully there was a definition of the sample itself so that it made sense to you. Was it off the west quarter? Was it Tom's hay? First cut no rain versus first cut with rain, some way to distinguish where the samples came from and the characteristics of it. Now, note the date that the samples were received by the lab, because most labs will keep a sample on hand for roughly 2 to 6 weeks, depending on how busy they are, and after that they throw them out. And this this lab report 70477 and lab number 328551, I looked at the trace mineral results and I noticed that something wasn't quite right. So I talked to the lab and asked them to retest the copper, manganese, and zinc levels. And sure enough, the numbers came back significantly different than what the original test results were. So if you're not sure about something, talk to somebody that is a beef nutritionist, private consultant, feed mill nutritionist, figure out if those numbers do make sense, and then call the lab back and ask for retesting to be done. Now, the other thing that there's a difference between different labs is some of them will use near-infrared spectrometry, which is a way that they bounce light waves off the sample, and what's reflected off, they collect the spectrum, and through calibration equations, they try to determine the proteins, fibers, and macro minerals, trace minerals from those numbers. And as you can see, the near-infrared and wet chemistry results are about the same. You know, protein, acid, detergent, fiber, NDF, very, very close. I wouldn't dispute either set of numbers. But if you had sent away the sample and they did the near-infrared spectrometry on those samples, you can see that there is a significant difference between calcium and phosphorus, magnesium, potassium, and sodium. Now, I noticed that there's a mistake on the phosphorus number for NIRS. That should be 0.38. But even so, excuse me, you can see that there's a 300% difference between NIR and wet chemistry for the calcium, and probably a 200% difference between the phosphorus levels. Now, when you look at those numbers and you try to use the information to develop a ration, having that much variance with NIRS, which is the newer technology, sometimes it works well, sometimes it doesn't. Wet chemistry is considered to be the gold standard, so I'd rather have all the minerals and trace minerals done by wet chemistry to make sure it's accurate. So if you've got sample results from NIRS, phone the labs, have them redo the minerals by wet chemistry. It may cost you another 10 bucks, maybe another 2 or 3 days longer, but the difference in the results makes a huge impact on what the recommendations are for your supplementation programs. And with that much difference between calcium and phosphorus, if it wasn't corrected, and same with the magnesium, you could run into problems with downer cows, winter tetany, and milk fevers. So when we look at the sample, the first thing we get to look at is moisture versus dry matter basis. There's two results that come in. I'm going to switch here quickly. Actually not, I'm going to go backwards. And when you send the sample in, if it's a hay, a grain, or a silage, you've got two components in that feed. You've got your moisture and you've got your dry matter. The combination of those two numbers should equal 100%. Now, typical moisture content in feeds for dry hay or green feeds is in that 15 to 17% range, 60 to 70% for chopped silage, and hopefully it's below 70%, because once you get over 70% for the chopped silage, you're going to have troubles with the pH, reducing the pH, because water can be a buffer. You might have some troubles with listeria and can have some fermentation problems with that. Round bale silage, any place from 22 to 55%, and thrashed cereal grains, any place from 12 to 18%. Now, what if we have a dry hay, a green feed, and a straw with feed test results? How do we know the difference between the two? So, for example, with the pit silage at 65% moisture and 3.8% protein on an as-fed basis, you divide the protein number by the percent of dry matter. So 100% total weight minus 65% moisture is equal to 35% dry matter, or 0.35. So 3.8% protein as fed divided by 0.35 gives you a 10.85% protein on a dry basis. So if we want to compare the alfalfa hay and the silage and the pea straw on an as-fed basis, you look at these numbers, if you don't convert them back to a dry basis, you would say that the alfalfa hay is, by far the best. And you'd be considering, well, pea straw at 5.8, it's better quality for protein than the barley silage without looking at the moisture. Changing it across to the dry matter basis, yes, your protein increases for all three ingredients, but you can see that your barley silage at 3.8% with 65% moisture goes up to 10.85 with the dry basis. And this works for any of the nutrients that you're looking at. When you go to the dry basis, you're comparing apples against apples for any samples that you're looking at. So it's the only way to do a true comparison. When we look at protein, one of the things that we're seeing this year on feed test results that are coming back from hay that was either cut a month late or 2 months late in the rain and turned in the swath 3 or 4 times, a lot of the feeds are not having a high enough amount of protein available to the animals. So there's a number of different things that you can use as supplementation. We'll get into that into our next webinar in 2 weeks' time. But peas, canola meal, tubs, or a 32% supplement are all options. So on this feed test result I'm using as an example, and this is one that just came in here about 2 weeks ago, we have a bunch of numbers underneath the protein section on the feed test report. The crude protein, ADICP, which is acid detergent insoluble crude protein, acid detergent insoluble crude protein as a percent of the crude protein. What is the soluble protein content? The percentage of soluble protein as a percent of the crude protein, and then the adjusted crude protein. Again, going between a dry basis and an as-fed, and most labs will give you a range of what's typically found in that type of forage. So, to give an explanation, crude protein, labs cannot test for crude protein itself. They do an extraction and determine the total amount of nitrogen in the sample. They multiply that nitrogen by 6.25 to get a percent protein. Now, protein is essential for growth, lactation, reproduction, and also keeping the microbial populations alive in the digestive system. Microbes are needed to digest the feeds, especially the fibers. And if you don't have enough protein, the populations drop. Some of these bacteria only have a lifespan of 20 minutes. So if the protein is low, fiber levels go down, or fiber digestion rates go down, the animals cannot eat as much on a daily basis. Now, it's very difficult for me to give you an example right off the top here as to what is needed, but animals at different stages of production or growth require different amounts of protein. So, for example, now I'll give you this very quickly. A cow in mid-pregnancy, late pregnancy, and after calving requires 7, 9, and 11% protein as a minimum amount to keep everything functioning properly. The soluble protein, or SP, that was on the previous slide is the amount of protein that is readily digested in the rumen. It's the feeds that the microbes can attack and digest completely. And there is a percentage of the protein that can be digested. So, for example, in the sample we had there, it was about a 35%. 35% of the protein was soluble, meaning 65% was soluble, which is typical for a hay, and 35% is a bypass or undegradable protein. So if you take the total protein minus your soluble, you get an undegradable or intake protein or a bypass protein. Now, bypass protein 15 years ago, we didn't really pay that much attention to it, but we've learned with newer research that you must have that bypass protein there to produce the milk proteins, and also for the development of lean tissue growth in calves or growing animals. So increasing the amount of canola meal or distillers grains, which are higher in bypass protein for the animals that are smaller, may improve their feed intake and also their rate of gain. But the important thing is for the cows as well, increasing that bypass to get the milk proteins levels up as well. The other protein tests that were mentioned there, ADICP, or acid detergent insoluble crude protein, is bales and even silages will go through a heating period, a sweat period, roughly any place from 2 to 12 days in length, depending on the type of product and temperatures out there in the field when the products are being baled up. Now, when the inside bale temperature gets above 35 degrees Celsius, there's a reaction within the bale that binds a percentage of the protein, available crude protein, to the fiber components, the acid detergent fiber and NDF, or neutral detergent fiber, and that way the fiber is ties up the protein, and it's not available to the animals. So bales that have this situation are the ones that, if you're looking at dry hay or green feed, the bales probably have squatted down. They're flattening out. If you get close to the bales, either they smell very sweet, almost like a silage smell, but it's not a true silage smell. But more typically, the feed turns brown, a dark brown, and smells like tobacco. That's an indication that you've got heat damage in the bales. Now, acid detergent insoluble crude protein as a percent of crude protein is an indication of how bad that heating damage has been in the bale. If it's below 5%, generally that's considered to be acceptable. As it goes up and that heating period continues, especially this year with the poor weather conditions, hay that was baled when it was not fully cured and the higher temperatures, that's when we're going to see this acid detergent insoluble crude protein going up. Now, when we look at this at the two different values, the true crude protein and then the adjusted crude protein, what it does is it makes an adjustment or reduces the amount of protein available to the animal by the amount that's tied up by the fiber. So let's say we've got a 12% protein level in the crude protein, the raw test, and then the acid detergent insoluble protein has a 2% component. That way you're going to be using 10% when you're doing your calculations, because that's the amount of protein that's available to the animals, not the total crude protein. Macro and trace minerals. This is one where no different than the proteins and energy requirements. Each animal has a different amount required on a daily basis, and it's difficult to give you an exact answer on this one right at this time, but it's something that we can go through and talk as far as ranges go. So on this feed test report, calcium 0.42, phosphorus 0.12, that tells me that this feed probably had someplace around 25 to 30% legume in the mixture. The field itself is probably something that could use a good dose of phosphorus fertilizer to increase that phosphorus level. Magnesium levels are typically short in most of the fields or most of the soils in Western Canada, so that level is down as well. Potassium looks normal. Iron, anything from 100 to 250 is very typical. You don't have to, when you have levels at this level, you don't have to supplement extra iron into the rations. There's more than enough there. The ones that are really different this year compared to most years, on average, manganese levels, typically on a normal year when it's a little bit drier, those levels are typically in that 40 to 45 range. Copper's in that 4 to 5 range, and zinc is usually 25. Now this year, with the high rainfall in some areas of the province, that has allowed higher amounts of mineralization of the trace minerals to occur, and the levels have gone up dramatically compared to normal. So spending that extra $10 and seeing the differentials on some of these values really makes a big difference in what the supplementation is needed for the animals. So how do we know what they need? A couple examples that I put together here. A 600-pound calf versus a cow in late pregnancy, you can see that their calcium requirements are about the same. Makes sense. Both of them are developing either bone structure in the calf, or they're developing bone structure of the fetus, so calcium levels are needed. Phosphorus, a little bit more for the cow in late pregnancy because she's pregnant and needs a higher amount of phosphorus for energy metabolism. Magnesium, copper, zinc, again, you can see that all of them are different, and you have to calculate out what's required using a program such as Cowbites. We went over this one before, so I'm just going to pass over this slide. The other trace minerals that are deficient in most areas of Western Canada, selenium, for example, is something that very seldom do we see a number that is excessive. The Crow's Nest Pass in southern Alberta is one area because they've got some plants that are selenium accumulators. There's an area up north, or basically almost straight east of Edmonton at Willingdon. There's a small pocket there with high levels. It's all due to the soil types in the province. But typically, anything that is north of Highway 1 and west, or excuse me, let's try this again. Areas that are south of Highway 1 and east of Highway 2, so that's Strathmore, Medicine Hat, Lethbridge area, they'll have a little bit more selenium than the rest of the province, but still deficient. Now, one of the things that is going under review right now is the Canadian Feeds Act, where they're going to be reviewing the amounts of minerals, salts, they're going to review the amount of selenium that's allowed in minerals, salts, and complete feeds. So it should be easier in the future to get the adequate amount of selenium that's required into these animals on a daily basis. Now, cobalt and iodine have been known to be virtually non-existent since the turn of the century. Again, no point testing this because we know that they're deficient. You should be supplying 100% of the requirements on a year-round supply. Fibers and energy. Two of the fiber levels that we need to look at on a feed test report is an acid detergent fiber, or an ADF, and the second one is an NDF. You can see that the numbers are, again, variable, with NDF being a minimum of 15 points higher than the acid detergent fiber. With these fiber numbers, they calculate out energy values for TDN, or digestible energy. Both of them are interchangeable, the net energy system, and we'll get into that right now. So acid detergent fiber is an indication of the maturity of the forage. It's used to estimate the energy content that's present in the forage. As the fiber level goes up by roughly 2% per week, your energy levels drop by a residual, by the same amount. So the more mature the plants are, the less energy you're going to have. Now, the difference between acid detergent fiber and neutral detergent fiber, if you look at the diagram, is the acid detergent fiber has cellulose, lignin, silica involved with that evaluation. The difference between the two is the hemicellulose. Hemicellulose is the glue between the cells in the plant structure that keeps the plant from falling over or lodging. Very difficult to digest. It's one of the things that we use to estimate the total dry matter intake so we can balance the ration on the amount of feed that the animals can actually eat. And the limit we use is when you have 1.2% of the body weight of neutral detergent fiber in the ration, when they consume that amount, the animal is going to stop eating because they're full. Now, if they're getting a lot of straw, low quality grass hay, something with neutral detergent fiber levels above 60% in the ration, you're going to have a bunch of residual feed staying in the rumen from the first day to the second day to the third day. And what that's actually going to do is reduce the total amount of feed that the animals are going to be able to eat. Now, when we mention that the fiber levels are used to estimate energy content, the one thing that there's different systems. The NFC that was on this report is something that includes the sugars, the starches, the galactans, and the pectins, which is important when calculating out a dairy ration. It's something that we don't typically do for beef cows or for other ruminants. The system that is commonly used by producers and extension people and nutritionists, depending on how extensive or how detailed they want to get, is they typically use the TDN, or total digestible nutrients, or the DE, digestible energy system. It's easy to use. There's only one number to consider. Both values are calculated from acid detergent fiber, and there are a number of different equations being used by different labs. And what I'm finding is at the center of the spectrum, those values are typically very close to what there is. On the tail ends, either high fiber levels or high or low fiber levels, the TDN and digestible energies can be off by 5, 6, 7%, and that's considerable. So I always go back to a document that Dr. Gary Matheson developed back in 1984 at the Feed Evaluation Unit at the University of Alberta. And those charts tend to improve the accuracy of the energy estimate, because some of these labs are down in Ithaca, New York, or different parts of the States, and with the differences in the number of daylight hours and weather patterns, that influences how fast or how slow fibers are deposited in the forages. And they develop their equations based on their local situation. So they don't take into consideration that northern Alberta, we can have 18 hours of sunlight in a day, which reduces the amount of fibers in these forages because they can grow a lot longer on a daily basis. And that way, that's where some of the error comes in. The net energy system, NEM, which is net energy of maintenance, NEG, net energy of gain, and net energy of lactation, NEL, is a system that was developed in California for researchers to get more precise on what's needed. Now, think of the net energy system as a series of 3 rain barrels. The first one being net energy of maintenance, the second one being net energy of gain, and the third one being net energy of lactation. And what happens is you need to fill that first barrel to the top to fill maintenance energy requirements before you can actually get any gain. Or if it's a cow that's lactating and she needs to gain a little bit of weight, there's no energy being partitioned by the system to produce the milk until net energy maintenance and net energy gain is completely full. So it's a system that's very, very accurate, but I'd rather work with one number that'll give me basically the same results. If you're doing experiments, then the net energy system seems to work a lot better.
Barry,
2 numbers? Yes, Dean.
A couple questions here.
Sure.
Just before you go on. When you're giving the ranges on these, is that done on a dry matter basis or as fed?
The ranges are given on a dry matter basis.
Okay. And this one, well, verbatim here, it says, what century were you referring to in the CO and the iodide test?
Those were determined in the late 1800s, early 1900s.
Good. Okay.
So that's been there a long time.
Yeah, no kidding. Okay, go ahead.
All right. 2 of the numbers that are on the feed test reports are the RFV and RFQ. And it's a way to evaluate feeds on a reference basis to see what the quality is. So in this sample, the RFV and RFQ were 91 and 96. So what do they mean? How do we use these numbers? Now, RFV, or relative feed quality, was originally designed for use by pure alfalfa forages. Basically, producers in southern Manitoba, North Dakota, South Dakota needed some way to have a simple evaluation on dairy quality when they were exporting hay down to Wisconsin or to the further east in the States, and they wanted a good quality alfalfa for the dairy cows. Now, there are a couple things that are needed when you try to develop your RFV. It ranks the different hays by the differences in potential for dry matter intake, and also digestibility of that dry matter. So a RFV value, or an index of 100 for relative feed value for the straight alfalfa, is a plant that has 41% acid detergent fiber and 53% neutral detergent fiber. And the equations are there on how they calculate it out. So it's just a simple way to compare one feed versus the other. But people get excited when they see their numbers only 85 or 90 versus 140 versus 150. The thing is, relative feed value was designed for 100% alfalfa stands, no grasses in it. Whereas the relative feed quality is something where they took into consideration that you've got mixed stands, and there's going to be a difference in digestibility between the alfalfa and the grasses. Now, this variability in fractions changes the digestibility of the feed, and therefore it's harder to get a true estimate of what's there. So if I had my druthers and you're using either a grass hay or a mixed grass alfalfa species, I'd be looking at the relative feed quality rather than the relative feed value. But as a nutritionist, these are relative amounts. My true answer comes in how much protein, how much energy, how much neutral detergent fibers there, how much will those animals eat, and I'd rather formulate a ration using those values than the RFV or the RFQ. But if you're buying the hay just to get an idea of what the quality is by looking at a single number or a second number, it's something that can be used. A couple other things that I'd like to chat about and typically don't show up on feed test results One of them is vitamin content of forages. We're more concerned about the fat-soluble vitamins, the vitamins A, D, and E. When you cut a hay crop or a green feed crop, there's always precursors for vitamin A, either the retinol form or beta-carotene form, and the vitamin E is tocopherol. Vitamin D is supplied by the sun. If you're looking at buying supplemental vitamin D, it's a form of cholecalciferol or cholecalciferol. Now, every fat-soluble vitamin is only stored in the body for a short period of time. Vitamin E is shorter than vitamin A, so having a sufficient amount on a daily basis is critical, and oxidation occurs in these forages roughly 30 to 90 days after the product has been cut. This year, with the rain damage, weather damage, the turning the hay, the oxidation would occur quicker than not. So the recommendation is start supplementing when hay is more than 3 to 6 months old. So if you cut your hay in July, by Christmas time, you need to be putting vitamins, all the vitamin requirements in there. Anything that has been put into a silage product, either chop silage, pit silage, bag silage, or heap silage, that fermentation process destroys the vitamin precursors, and you have to start supplementing 100% of the vitamin requirements at the time that you start feeding these silage products. So it's not worth your time and effort to test for vitamins. Samples can be any place from $300 to $400 per vitamin to be tested. There's very few labs that do it. Generally, they're in the States, and they can cost any place from $300 to $400 a sample. So it's more effective and cheaper to supply 100% of the requirements going into winter and throughout the winter until the animals go back onto grass. The critical one that we saw for the last couple of years after the BASF fire in Germany, the vitamin supplies were low, prices went up, but the big thing is if you're short of vitamin A and vitamin E is required to develop the antibodies found in the colostrum. It's the only way that vitamin E gets into the calf, so supplementing that at least for the last 2 months prior to calving is critical. Vitamin A, again, if there's been troubles in the past where you don't have animals with healthy calves, or you got calves that get sick within a couple of days or even a couple of weeks of being born, that's an indication to me that the colostrum quality and the vitamin supplementation may have been part of the problem because of the reduced immune function. Nitrates and mycotoxins. Nitrates, if I had $1 for every time I got a call on this from the last 35 years, I wouldn't have to worry about my retirement. But nitrates can occur during a drought, after a hail, light frosts, or after herbicide application. Now, it all depends on the weather, how much fertilizer or manure that was applied, the year that the crop was grown. If the field's been used for swath grazing or bale grazing for a number of years, your nitrate levels or nitrogen content in the soil can go up, and that will all impact the possibility of having nitrates. Now, nitrate levels will peak 4 days after a light hail or a frost. And basically, the leaves cannot convert the nitrates into protein efficiently, and then you get the increase in content. If plants recover after a hailstorm, levels return to normal roughly 10 to 14 days after the injury. Herbicide application, it depends on the products used, the strength applied, and the weather conditions as well. but typically your weeds are the ones that will have more nitrate accumulation than the crop. Legumes have nodules in the root system. They limit the amount of nitrogen going into the plant on a daily basis. So in that case, alfalfas, peas, vetches, clovers, sainfoin, they do not accumulate nitrates. That's not a concern. Mycotoxins, the ones that the molds that are on the plants, if you see green, blue, red, and pink molds, there is a possibility that they can develop mycotoxins. Now, they need specific environmental conditions for the different types of molds that are growing to develop the mycotoxins, and I could spend an hour on that right now if we wanted to, but basically, if you're not sure, test it. Now, some labs, if you send a sample away and you ask for a mold test, what they'll do is a CFU, or a colony forming unit evaluation, saying that you've got so many colonies per gram of Ascochyta or some other mold that is present. It'll give you a rough idea how bad the contamination is, but it does not give you the specific information on, is the mycotoxin present? If it is present, what's the concentration? One that is showing up quite a bit this year is fusarium, and the second one is ergot. And there's levels that are considered to be enough to cause problems. For example, ergot, they test for 7 ergot alkaloids. If there is more than 200 parts per billion of those 7 ergot alkaloids in total, that'll reduce animal performance, being either milk production, reproductive efficiency. So you have to get the right type of test done to get those analyzed and get a result that we can work with. The other thing that you can see on some test results, the NDF digestibility or undegradable NDF or neutral detergent fiber, again, different lengths of time, different results, but these are typically used for dairy cows. They're not typically used for beef cattle. So in conclusion, it takes a little bit of time and effort to understand what normal values are on a test report. For those that are novices at this, don't be afraid to call a nutritionist. Somebody at the Ag Info Center can give you help with that, and we can talk through what the values are, if they make sense, or how they can be applied to different animals when you're trying to make a ration. Feed labs can make mistakes. If something looks unusual, ask for a retest. It doesn't happen very often, but every once in a while, either a machine will be out of calibration or the sample itself at the lab wasn't sampled properly. You need to check it out, and that's where you ask for help. Does this make sense? And you can't wait for 6 months to do that, because they will throw the samples out and there's nothing for them to retest with. Use a ration balancing software package such as Cowbites to develop rations. There are a couple feed value indicators on the Beef Cattle Research Council website, testing feeds. One's for looking at individual feeds and saying, okay, does this meet the requirements of an animal, be it a lactating cow or a dry cow? And it'll tell you what's good, what's bad, and what's ugly. And the other one is working more with the economics. Is the price that you're going to pay for a certain type of hay based on quality economically feasible, or is it something that needs to be discounted or pay a premium for because it is higher quality? The only thing I can suggest is ask for help to develop the feeding programs if it's something that you're not comfortable doing. And over the last couple of years, with feed costs being a little bit higher than they are this year, balancing the rations, doing the feed testing for families or people other people that you're about, other people that you that I've done rations for, any place from $50 to $150 a month, or $50 to $150 a year difference in winter feeding costs. And with that, my contact information is on the screen. Dean mentioned previously that the webinar will be up on YouTube within the next couple of days. So don't be afraid to either contact me by email or by phone, and we can work together on whatever needs to be done. Back to you, Dean.
Okay, thanks, Barry. Don't have any other questions other than the two that were posed earlier. So we'll just wait a little bit here and see if anybody has any other questions. There was a lot, that was a lot of information, and probably it takes a little bit to digest a lot of that. No pun intended there, but it was, there seems to, I think that, you're, to me, Barry is very much an expert in this area, and anybody that needs some assistance, he's very good at what he does. So don't be afraid to contact him. I know he's, sometimes during the year he is quite busy, but that's a good sign that, he's what he does, and what he put the expertise that he has is well known and well regarded. So like I said, it's on the screen there, and you can get a hold of him that way or through the Ag Info Center. So anything that you think that would be good to highlight one more time before we try and get some more questions, Barry?
The only thing is, if you spent the time to take the samples, pay for the results, the worst thing that can happen is you don't know what to do with them. You throw them into the drawer in the desk, and you don't use the information that's there to help you manage your cows over the winter. Hello?
Yeah, still here. No, that's good.
Okay. No, I just got a notice that I'm going to time out here in a little bit. So
yeah, I saw that notice. So okay. No, I don't see any other questions coming through. Oh, there we go. Question about free choice of supplement tubs. Will cows overfeed on them, or do they just do what's needed?
Consumption of protein tubs or mineral tubs, depending on how they're formulated, the boss cows can very easily overconsume what's required. The timid heifers or the younger animals, they'll get pushed away. They won't get what they require. The big thing with them is evaluate your cost. And this is something we'll talk about in 2 weeks' time, is what products should be used in a program. But I find that when you're paying any place from 50 to 85 cents per day per cow for your mineral package, when you can do the same job or even a better job by mixing it in with the grain or using loose formulations for 12 to 16 cents a day, I find that a lot of these tubs, unless you're in a pasture situation where you've got no other choice on how you're going to supplement the animals, they tend to be a little bit expensive.
Okay, good, thanks. The one comment, I'm not sure if it fits within this presentation, but is about molasses. And do you have any comments on that?
Again, molasses is a product on straw bales that is put on at someplace between 75 pounds and 100 pounds per bale, resulting in the cow that is eating 20 pounds of straw to get any place from 1.5 to 2 pounds of molasses a day. Yes, it will do a good job to increase your protein content by 1 or 2%, but like any liquid product, there's very little calcium, very little phosphorus in there, so it doesn't do a complete job. You're still going to have to add minerals to your feeding program, and again, your cost is very high. It's a lot cheaper to feed an extra 2 pounds of barley or 1.5 pounds of barley to replace the energy from the molasses and do a better job. All right, I've got 10 minutes here, but that's okay.
Okay.
That's no trouble there. I was scared I was going to just drop off the side of the world here.
Yeah, no, you're good.
So
One more
again,
question.
one more, and
One more,
again,
yeah,
next
then we'll
time.
leave it up. Okay, so last question here. What is the best way to get the vitamins into the cows without storage spoilage? Sorry.
Vitamins should be kept dry and in a cool location. So if you've got an old wooden granary or an old barn where you can keep the product cool during the summertime, that is the best way to do it. You can mix it in with salt and mineral. The trick is when it gets wet, that's when you lose your vitamin activity. So if you are mixing it together, put out only enough for about 4 or 5 days. Let them clean it up and put fresh product out. Mixing it with the grain or with a silage, that's probably your best way to get the right amount to the animals on average over a week's period of time.
Okay, very good. Okay, with that, I think we will close off the webinar. I'd like to thank everybody for attending. And like Barry said, this webinar will be up on YouTube probably within the next few days or so. So if you missed anything, you can check it out there. Also, you'll get a link to the recording on an email. So with that, and you can view it that way as well. So with that, we will close out the webinar. I would like to thank Barry for his presentation, and everybody have a good night. Thanks.